Good to see you all once again this evening. If you want to be opening your Bibles to the book of 2 Samuel is where we're going to be at tonight, 2 Samuel. Returning to our study on the life of David, we began looking at the account of 2 Samuel, and that begins with the close of Saul's reign and the appointment of David finally as king. If you remember last time in our study on that, we noted that one modern application, one takeaway that we as the people of God learned from the opening chapters of 2 Samuel is that God does indeed fulfill his promises. It may not be on our timetable, but it will be done on God's timetable and when he brings it about. David had waited several decades from the day that Samuel anointed him as king over Israel to the day he finally consolidated power and was crowned king. And I find it very telling when you look at the reigns of the kings in Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings of what is the king's first action. Since the since the presidency of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, although some might say it was a reign. He served 4 consecutive terms, unparalleled in American history. But since FDR's term in office, in this country at least, what every president since then, they've focused on the first 100 days. That kind of sets the tone of the presidency. And there's a big push to achieve something great in those first 100 days. Because FDR, his first 100 days, he got a whole slew of legislation passed to try and deal with the Great Depression and so forth. You know, we think of kings who would come after David. I think of Jeroboam. Well, think of some of the first acts of him as king is to create a false religion and to break away from the rest of the tribes. You think of later kings like Hezekiah. Their first acts are to restore faithful worship. David's first act as king, or one of his first chief goals, if you will, of his administration, is to bring the Ark of the Covenant back to Jerusalem. After chapter 5 ends with the anointing of David as king, we begin in chapter 6. And for our study tonight, we're actually going to be in the 2 Samuel, and we're going to be in Chronicles as well. Samuel's account gives us the abbreviated, I believe the abbreviated version of this event. Chronicles gives us some of the more information. So if you want to put a bookmark here in 2 Samuel 6, we'll be coming back and forth to this passage throughout the evening. But reading the first 11 verses here from the Legacy Standard Version of your Bibles, we're going to find out that it's not as simple as just bringing the ark back to Jerusalem. Then David again gathered all the chosen men of Israel, 30,000. And David arose and went with all the people who were with him from Baal Judah to bring up from there the ark of God, which is called by the very name of Yahweh of hosts, who was enthroned above the cherubim. And they drove the ark of God on a new cart, that they might bring it from the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill. And Uzzah and Iho, the sons of Abinadab, were leading the new cart. And they brought it with the ark of God to the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill. And Iho was walking ahead of the ark. Now David and all the house of Israel were celebrating before Yahweh, with all kinds of instruments made of fir wood, and with lyres and harps, tambourines, castines, and cymbals. Then they came to the threshing floor of Nacon, and Uzzah reached out toward the ark of God and took hold of it, because the oxen nearly upset it. And the anger of Yahweh burned against Uzzah, and God struck him down for his irreverence. And he died there by the ark of God. And David became very angry because of Yahweh's breaking out against Uzzah. And that place is called Perez Uzzah to this day. So David was afraid of Yahweh that day, and he said, "How can the ark of Yahweh come to me?" And David was unwilling to move the ark of Yahweh into the city of David with him. But David took it aside to the house of Obed-Edom, the Gittite. Thus the ark of Yahweh remained in the house of Obed-Edom, the Gittite, 3 months. And Yahweh blessed Obed-Edom and all his household. Obviously, this moving the ark doesn't go according to plan. There's some trouble that happens in this. And much like, I'm going to probably echo a lot of the comments we've been making in our Revelation class about the justice of God and his holiness. But many people have pointed to this section here to try and make a caricature of God, that he is acting unjustly here or he's having a temper tantrum. That is not the case. That is not the case. The chronicler, or Samuel, or the writer of 2 Samuel tells us, well, describes the action of Uzzah here. If you want to look back down there in verse 7, God struck him down for his irreverence. That is, to treat God in a way that he is undeserving of, to be flippant about God or the things of God. But the thing is, Uzzah gets the strike, if you will. As we're going to find out, Uzzah is not the only guilty party here. The whole priesthood is at fault. Everyone who is of understanding is at fault. And we're not going to go into all the details about this, because I believe I preached on this last year. But it's interesting, it's not just that they're moving the ark on a new cart. That's part of it. But the ark is not covered, as the law stated. That the ark is not being transported rightly, and it's not being regarded as holy. Not that it's somehow in of itself holy object, but it's a thing of God. And God has subscribed, this is how you transport the ark. And how you follow God's commands or you don't follow God's commands reveals a whole lot about how you view God. I think one thing that oftentimes gets overlooked, I have this, it's a running list in my mind of grace and judgment. Because oftentimes when you see a judgment of God being handed out, it is oftentimes not as severe as God would be able to judge, if that makes sense. Case in point, Genesis 3. Adam and Eve should have died that day. That's the soul that sins shall die, period. They didn't. Yes, they removed from the Garden of the Garden of Eden. Yes, they removed from the Tree of Life. Yes, they became aware of sin. There's a whole bunch of consequences. God has to remove them from his presence because of that. But think about it. These creatures of the dirt, God clothed. God did not kill them that day. And here we see the judgment against Uzzah, but there's even some mercy in this, in that everyone technically should have died because no one except the priests are supposed to look upon the ark uncovered. And they all live. It's not that God's being inconsistent. God has a lot of tolerance and mercy for his people, but that only goes to a point. See, really what we're seeing here, by way of illustration, it's like a construction crew building a house. The concrete guys came in, laid their foundation, that's fine, and the framers framed it, and the electricians beginning to wire. And all throughout this whole construction process, everyone's been kind of cutting corners here and there. And the electrician, he's of an old school sort where he doesn't believe you need to turn off the electricity first. He'd rather just do it live because he's skillful and he can do that. Oh, he can do that. He's fine. The concrete guys are fine. You know, it's not hurting them. The framers, they're doing fine because it's not hurting them. Well, here comes the sheetrock guy. And he's putting up the sheetrock and he moves his hand over an open outlet and touches the live wire. He didn't do anything wrong in of itself. But he was part of a whole process of a construction crew that was cutting corners, wasn't following code, and so somebody suffered the consequences of that. Now David, I think, has the right response. He is bewildered. He's angry at the whole situation. Somebody died. That's not good. He can't bring the ark of God to him, and he's terrified. So he leaves it with Obed-Edom and his household for 3 months. Now, what happens in that 3-month time period? Well, David is not a man to sit on his hands. Now, the text doesn't tell us he went and studied his Pentateuch. But based on the Chronicle account, David came into some information that explained to him why all this happened. So we go over to 1 Chronicles in chapter 13. And this is the chronicler's account of the same event. I remind you that Chronicles is written after the return from captivity. And so they're writing from several centuries removed from this. This is probably Ezra or whoever is the chronicler is going back over the records and compiling this. And if memory serves me correctly, the title in the Septuagint, I think in the Hebrew, is the things omitted. This is the filling in the gaps of the accounts of Samuel and Kings. And in chapter 13, the first 4 verses of 1 Chronicles, we see here it says, David took counsel with the commanders of the thousands and the hundreds, even with every leader. And David said to all the assembly of Israel, if it seems good to you, and if it is from Yahweh our God, let us send everywhere to our relatives who remain in all the lands of Israel, also to the priests and the Levites, who are with them in their cities and pasture lands, so they may gather with us. And let us bring back the ark of our God to us. And this is key here, for we did not seek it in the days of Saul. Then the assembly said that they would do so, for the thing was right in the eyes of the people. Now, Samuel's account is not wrong. Samuel's account is just brief, that they were getting together to get the ark back. Chronicles tells us kind of the inner workings of what happened. David had purpose in his heart. He wants to do this. He consults with the leaders of the people. And he's not saying, if it seems good in your sight, we'll go do this. It's both. If I have the approval of the people, and this thing that we are thinking about doing is of God, then we will go get the ark. And the reason, as I pointed out in the end of verse 3 here, this tells us a lot about the situation. We did not seek it in the days of Saul. Think back many months ago in 1 Samuel. 1 Samuel 5, 6, and 7. I believe it's chapter 7. Samuel has to get the people of Israel to stop worshiping idols again. They had just barely recovered the ark. In chapter 8, they start going after the other nations. They appoint a king. And the implication from David's statement here, and from what we know of the time of Saul, is the people of God were not worshiping or following him exactly as he had prescribed in the law. And so David, no fault of his own, grows up in a culture that is ignorant, for the most part, of God's law. Yes, they know the feast days and so forth, but I would suggest to you that Jews keeping the feast days in periods of unfaithfulness is like many people today thinking that Christmas is an actual Christian holiday. You may have the terminology, but it's not the same. So David grows up in a culture where he's probably not taught the law exactly as he ought to have been. There's ignorance not only of the commoner, which is understandable, but also of the priesthood about the proper procedures to carry the ark. And this is merely a symptom of a larger problem. I mean, we could go forward in Israel's history or backwards in Israel's history. In the days of Hosea, in Hosea chapter 4 and verse 6, Hosea makes that, or God through Hosea makes that statement, my people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. Or you go back to Numbers, chapter 10 with Nadab and Abihu. That one is particularly egregious to me. Because if you follow the whole narrative of Numbers, Nadab and Abihu just were consecrated as priests to God. Like they had just gotten the whole lecture of this is how you do the worship. Here's how you approach God. They were given all the information, and the first act they do is they basically say, oh, this is nice. This pretends the law of God. Oh, this is nice. I like this better. And they die for it. And what's interesting is when Moses, I think, is anticipating Aaron to object, and that's why Moses says there around verse 4, be silent on this matter. For God said those who would come near me must treat me as holy. Nadab and Abihu did not do that. And so this event here isn't an isolated incident. And trying to make some modern applications or parallels. Something to consider when you hear of congregations of the Lord's people make a departure. Just know that that wasn't an isolated incident. Even in Tucson here in the last couple of years, there was a congregation of the Lord's people who added unscriptural worship. They added the instrument. Okay, that was the dividing line for a lot of people. But I had to tell some friends, you need to be aware. That may have been the dividing line, but that was just a road stop on a longer list of issues. Okay. And every time you see a divergence, a digression, a compromise on doctrine of worship, of the understanding of God, we need to understand that it's not an isolated incident. It's always a symptom of a larger problem. And I sound like a broken record at this point, but I would say the underlying root cause is always the same. It's Romans 1. The people of God did not honor him or give him thanks. We've studied a lot about King Saul. And that's a sad epitaph that you could put on his tombstone. He did not honor God nor give him thanks. And so his heart was darkened. I jumped ahead of my outline, apologize for that, but now we find out David, what he did in those 3 months here. You go ahead, now it's interesting, in the Chronicle account, we ended verse 14, the ark is at Obed-Edom's house for 3 months. Chapter 14, Chronicler reminds us that David still has an issue. He amasses more wives during this time period in those 3 months between these two events. He attacks the Philistines, doing what God had commanded of him. We get to chapter 15, and we find out that David apparently in those 3 months had studied his law, which makes sense. Back in Deuteronomy and the law, God made the provision for when there would be kings, that one of the things they were supposed to do when they ascended to the throne, they were to make a copy of the law by hand in the presence of the Levitical priest, that he may read from it and meditate upon it. So, did it always work that way? Probably not. But if there are any kings that actually would have done that, it's probably David. So David's one of the few guys who has his own copy of the law. He can go and consult it. Makes sense. He's the king. He's supposed to administer the law. And we see in verse 1 of 1 Chronicles 15. Then David made houses for himself in the city of David, and he prepared a place for the ark of God and pitched a tent for it. And David said, no one is to carry the ark of God but the Levites, for Yahweh chose them to carry the ark of God and to minister to him forever. Then David assembled all Israel at Jerusalem to bring up the ark of Yahweh to its place, which he had prepared for it. And David gathered together the sons of Aaron and the Levites. Now I think it's very interesting that where did David get this information? Well, Numbers 4 and verse 15, Deuteronomy 10 and verse 8, those are two examples of where the law prescribed how the ark was to be carried. And I think this tells us a lot about David's character. David's not one to let other people fix his problems. He initiated this idea. A man died in this whole process. Here's what Saul would have done. High priest, come here. This is your fault. You need to figure this out. Let me know when you can come up with an answer. David goes, no, I'm the king. I initiated this. This is my problem. So I'm going to go study the law. And this is one of those rare times where you have the king telling the priesthood what they did wrong. Says, you all should have known better. Only the Levites can carry the ark, and this is how you carry it. And so once they get that cleared up, you look down in verse 11 through verse 15. Then David called for Zadok and Abiathar the priests, and for the Levites, and Uriel, and Asaiah, and Joel, and Shemaiah, and Eliel, and Aminadab. And he said to them, you are the heads of the fathers' households of the Levites. Set yourselves apart as holy, both you and your relatives, that you may bring the ark of Yahweh, the God of Israel, to the place that I had prepared for it. Because you did not carry it at first, Yahweh our God broke out against us, for we did not seek him according to the legal judgment. So the priests and the Levites set themselves apart as holy, to bring up the ark of Yahweh, the God of Israel. And the sons of the Levites carried the ark of God on their shoulders, with the poles thereon, as Moses had commanded, according to the word of Yahweh. Why David takes ownership of the situation, why David does the study, corrects the priest, and David includes the fact that he doesn't say Uzzah. God struck out against all of them. Uzzah, yes, might have been the lightning rod, but that judgment was upon the whole nation. But David does not let the priests go scot-free. He says, you did not carry it right, and because you failed in this, God struck out against all of us. While he's correcting the situation, he's not letting them off easy because they were the ones with the privileges and the blessings and the responsibility to know what it said, to administer the law, and to minister to the people of God on their behalf. Now, you and I don't live in that kind of system. Peter makes it pretty clear over in 1 Peter. I know it's not on the board. In the book of 1 Peter, I believe it's going to be chapter 2. Yes, chapter 2, verse 9. Speaking about us being as living stones, being built up into a temple of praise, Peter writes to us, he says, you are a chosen family, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for God's own possession, so you may proclaim the excellencies of him who has called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. For once you were not a people, but now you are the people of God. You had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. Note what Peter's saying here. Today, there is a priesthood of all believers. All of us have the responsibility to offer up holy worship to God that is acceptable and pleasing to him, to be exacting with his word, and to follow it to the best of our ability as he has commanded us. And so all the things that we're learning about the failures of the priesthood and what their job were in the Old Testament, we can make a parallel point to us today. Am I too flippant in my worship? Lord knows I have been. Am I too uninvolved? Have I given considered thought when I come to the meeting house to actually offer up worship? You know, when it says there, when David tells the priest, set yourselves apart as holy, there was a whole ritual that the Levites had to go through of ceremonially cleansing themselves and making themselves ready to come near the ark so that they could carry the ark. Same thing with the priest and the high priest. They had to make themselves ready before they could worship. And if they didn't do those things, Exodus, Numbers, Deuteronomy is all very clear. They ran the risk of the holiness of God lashing out against them or breaking out against them. And yes, we don't live in that system today, but think of the parallels. Do I approach my worship like Uzzah or Nadab and Abihu or the sons of Eli? Or do I approach my worship as the faithful priest that we read about, few and far between, albeit, in the Old Testament? Do we prepare ourselves like David did here before the 15th chapter? He made earnest inquiry into what the law said. What did God expect? What did God desire that he may be honored? And then do I go and do that? Because once the ark is properly carried, it makes its way to Jerusalem. And David, much to one of his wives' chagrin, is very excited about this. The fact that the ark is back to where it belongs, within the territory of the people of God. There's a new the tabernacle's erected for it, and we get to worship, and we're restoring and we're worshiping God as we ought to. You look here in verse 12, back in 2 Samuel 6. Then it was told to King David, saying, Yahweh has blessed the house of Obed-Edom and all that belongs to him on account of the ark of God. So David went up and brought up the ark of God from the house of Obed-Edom into the city of David with gladness. And so it happened that when those who were carrying the ark of Yahweh had gone 6 paces, he sacrificed an ox and a fatling. And David was dancing before Yahweh with all his strength, and David was girded with a linen ephod. So David and all the house of Israel were bringing up the ark of Yahweh with shouting and the sound of the trumpet. Now, verses 16 through the end of the chapter, David continues to celebrate and worship and praise God. And then we find out that Michal, the daughter of Saul, the wife of David, becomes very upset at this whole, in her mind, debacle. This whole mockery of who a king should be. And I find it interesting that she states her displeasure in this whole thing. And we see in verse 21, so David said to her, it was before Yahweh who chose me above your father and above all his house to appoint me ruler over the people of Yahweh, over Israel. Therefore, I will celebrate before Yahweh, and I will be esteemed even more lightly than this, and be humbled in my own eyes. But with the maids of whom you have spoken, with them I will be glorified. And Michal, the daughter of Saul, had no child to the day of her death. One of the interesting things about Old Testament narrative is, oftentimes Old Testament narrative likes to show and not tell. It'd rather show you the events, not tell you what's going on, because God inspired it, and in that culture, the moral implications and judgments should be obvious. So when an Old Testament narrative text does tell us something, that's a way for us to be like, hey, you really need to pay attention to this. here the thing we need to pay attention to is, it's not so much Michal being childless to the day of her death. It's more of David. David is enthralled with the worship of his God. And even one of his wives being upset and causing a whole scene was not going to change his devotion or determination to glorify God in worship. Sometimes serving God isn't easy, even in worship, even in a joyous occasion, because, well, as we see here, David, to quote a New Testament principle, may have been unequally yoked with a woman who did not value the same things as he did, but rather was too concerned, much like her dad was, with appearance, with what seemed honorable and right, and what that she thought kings ought to do. In chapter 7, I know it's not on the board, the ark comes to the tent David has erected. God blesses David's house, and David magnifies the name of Yahweh at the end of the chapter. In chapter 8, David cleans up house by striking down the nations, and we see several things happening. David shows loving kindness to one of the last descendants of Saul, as he promised previously. But unfortunately for us, as we get further on in our series, this preview of coming attractions, this is probably one of the last good chapters in David's life, as far as we have record of. Pretty soon, David is going to start acting in ways similar to Saul. He will commit the great sin with Bathsheba. That, I've said before, comes from an ungrateful, unthankful heart of all that God had given him. And David will have to deal with war and chaos within his own home till the day of his death. And David stands as a model of faithfulness, but also as a cautionary tale. That you can start out really strong, but if you don't keep your eyes on the prize, if you don't keep focus, if you don't keep the heart full of worship, if David had simply maintained the attitude and the disposition that we've read about tonight, he may have saved himself from a world of hurt. And maybe some takeaways for us as we bring this to a close here. We were talking about this Wednesday night in our Bible class about Revelation's calls to worship. Worship, when done to glorify God in his ways, is a balm, a comfort, and a safeguard for us as his people. When we start distorting that, or we don't have the right motivations or attitudes in our worship, it's like opening up our armor for attack. God designed worship for our benefit. And as priests of his today, we have to take it seriously. Otherwise, we will get none of the blessings that he has built into it. Appreciate your kind attention. I look out tonight. I know all these faces. If there's one tonight, perhaps because I don't know your heart, and you need to put on Christ in baptism for the salvation of your soul, Jesus' promise still holds true that he who believes and is baptized shall be saved. But maybe tonight you're struggling and you need encouragement, or maybe there's sin in your life. If you're subject to the invitation, won't you meet me down front as they stand and sing the song that's been selected?